Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Drisha. This class is investigating the doctrine of Chosenness with Rabbi Samuel Lebens. I think most of you were here last week, so I'll just really quickly say that you're welcome to engage in class by speaking up or writing in the chat as always. And with that, I'll turn this to you, Rabbi Lebens.
Hey, okay. So what we've done so far in the course is we've looked at various biblical models of chosenness. The three that we looked at were the account of chosenness that emerges from the book of Genesis, call it the Genesis model, the marriage model that makes it look like God fell in love with the Jewish people, and the covenant between God and the Jewish people is like a marriage, and the priesthood model where we are like priests, a nation of priests to serve the rest of the world. There are various tensions between those three models and commonalities between them. And any post-biblical Jewish philosopher who wants to come up with a kind of doctrine of chosenness, try to explain what it is that we believe in when we say that we're a chosen people, going to have to juggle with those biblical models, that biblical data that we've looked at up until now. In this class, I want to share with you three rather surprising medieval accounts of chosenness. I want to say a little bit about what makes them surprising. And then if we have any time left over, I want to share with you one more early modern account of chosenness, which is perhaps less surprising and perhaps more in tune with the biblical stuff we've looked at up until now. Okay, so with that introduction behind us, I'm going to jump in. There's quite a lot to cover in this, our final session. I'm going to start with Saadia Gaon. Saadia Gaon is perhaps Judaism's first rabbinic philosopher. Of course, rabbis were thinking philosophical thoughts long before him in the Mishnah, in the Gemara. What I mean by first rabbinic philosopher is the first member of the rabbinic movement to have been completely well versed in Greek and secular philosophy of his age. Philo of Alexandria beats him by some way, but he wasn't a rabbinic Jew. He was a pre-rabbinic Jew. So if you're looking for the first rabbinic philosopher, Saadia Gaon has a good claim to being that. Now, in his magnum opus called Emunot V'Deot, the book of opinions and beliefs, he doesn't dedicate a chapter or a book to the notion of chosenness. It doesn't feature as you know, in his page of contents. In fact, believe it or not, Saadia Gaon is sometimes credited with being the first writer to have a contents page. In all of Western literature, there were no such thing as a contents page before Saadia Gaon wrote his Emunot V'Deot. So anyway, if you look through his contents page, you won't find a chapter dedicated to chosenness. So if you want to figure out what it is that Saadia Gaon would have to say about chosenness, you really have to dig around in his writings. Here is one, I think, major element of his view, and it's in the introduction to his book, Emunot V'Deot. He says the following: "It behooves us also to believe that even before the era of the children of Israel, God never left his creatures without a religion fortified by prophecy and miraculous signs and manifest proofs." So in this part of the book, in this part of the introduction, Saadia Gaon is relating to the fact that Judaism was inaugurated at Mount Sinai. This is very fitting for a pre-Shavuot shiur, right? Judaism was inaugurated at a very public miracle at Mount Sinai. There was all sorts of technicolor razzmatazz at that beginning. And you might ask, well, why did God do that for the Jews and not for anybody else? First of all, Saadia Gaon says it was really important that Judaism began with such a miracle, because even though, to his philosophical mind, the 613 laws of the Torah make great philosophical sense. So much so that if you had enough time and enough brains, you'd figure out many of them for yourself. Nonetheless, not all of us have enough brains or enough time to figure these things out. So God gave us a Torah. How do we know it was God? Well, the miraculousness of the inauguration helps us to trust that this isn't some scam. This comes from God, and these public miracles are the sort of thing that even the uneducated can understand, right? Because you don't, it doesn't take great brains to recognize tremendous razzmatazz. So then he said, so then the question is, okay, fine. So I understand why Judaism had to start with such big miracles, but why was it only to the Jews? And his response to that question is, surprisingly, it behooves us also to believe that even before the era of the children of Israel, God never left his creatures without a religion fortified by prophecy and miraculous signs and manifest proofs. In other words, it's not fitting for God to have only given a Torah to the Jewish people. He must have done it to other peoples beforehand. It behooves us to believe that, right? That before, because God would never have left humanity in the dark, right? And whoever would have witnessed the latter in person, those miracles in person, would have been convinced of their authenticity by what he had perceived with his sense of vision. He again, to whom it was transmitted in later generations, for example, would be convinced by what he'd grasped by means of his sense of hearing, which allowed him to receive the testimony of the previous generation. So I can't fill out the details for you because he doesn't give us the details. But one potential Sagigaonic vision is this: every nation at its foundation had massive miracles like those of Mount Sinai, but the Jews happened to be the only nation to have remembered theirs, the only nation to have succeeded in passing down testimony in a chain like that. But you say, hold on a minute, but what about the marriage model? The marriage model in the Bible, where God says, I love you, you're the greatest, of all the peoples, you're the ones I've known. Sajigan is not impressed by that stuff. He says the following. This is from book 2, chapter 10 of Imunot B'Dayot. He says, as regards the matter of possession, like when God says we're his Am Segula, his special possession, inasmuch as all creatures are God's creation and handiwork, it's not seemly for us to say that he possesses one thing to the exclusion of another. It's not seemly to say that the Jews belong to him, but the French don't, right? That's unseemly. Nor that he possesses the one to a greater and the other to a lesser degree. If we nevertheless see the scriptures assert that a certain people is his particular property and his possession and his portion and inheritance, as they do in the statement, for the portion of the Lord is his people, Jacob the lot of his inheritance, that is done merely as a means of conferring honor and distinction. What? Okay. I have a friend, a teacher, who always tells her students, each and every one of them, this is her go-to phrase. She looks them in the eyes and she says, "You're the best." But the thing is, she says that to everybody. And since she says it to everybody, and it's unlikely they're all joint best, what she's saying is not strictly speaking true. It's false. Well, yeah, it's false if you take her speech act to be a description, right? You are the best. But that's not what her speech act is. Her speech act is a mode of conferring love, honor, care, right? If taken literally, it's false, but it's not supposed to be taken literally. Says Sajid Gaon, every time that the Bible speaks about the Jewish people as if they're special, it's not any different to my friend, the teacher, who tells all of her students, "You're the best." It's very nice. It's sincere. It's loving. But, don't don't go home and think, "Oh, I'm the best," right? Because no, that doesn't follow from the fact that the teacher said you're the best. That would be misinterpreting the sort of speech act it is. So then you say, okay, so is there nothing special about being Jewish according to Satyagaon? Well, it seems like he thought the following. He thought that um, God doesn't repeat his miracles very often because um, he wants the world to operate according to science and reason. Because if there are miracles every 50 seconds, right, you wouldn't be able to kind of predict how the world around us works. Science wouldn't be able to get going, charting the patterns in nature. Because if there was a miracle every 50 seconds, there would be no patterns in nature. So, according to Satyagaon, miracles need to be few and far between. So, so to put it really bluntly, if God inaugurated a religion for, I don't know, the Fijians, and and they forgot about it after 25 generations, and they lost their tradition, then tough luck. God isn't going to do it again. He's not going to re-miracle, because God doesn't do miracles very often. Perhaps as long as there is at least one religion left on earth, because the Gentiles can learn from Judaism what minimally God expects for them. Those are called the seven Noahide mitzvot. So as long as there's one godly religion left on earth, God doesn't have to keep re-inaugurating other religions. So the Jews deserve some credit, credit that other peoples don't necessarily deserve, because we managed to hold on to our religion. And that was a tough achievement, and it took perseverance and a certain type of stiff-neckedness, a certain type of stubbornness to hold on to our religion over all of those years. And for that reason, Satyagaon thinks that there's going to be two afterlives. And this he reads out of the Bible. He says you couldn't derive this from reason alone. This is based on his reading of biblical teaching. He says there are going to be two afterlives. The first afterlife is going to be just for the Jews. The Jews get resurrected, and they get to enjoy a 1,000-year kingdom of the Messiah. And the reason they get this special reward is because they've done something special as a people, which was to hold on to their religion when everybody else forgot theirs. And then there's going to be a second afterlife, which lasts forever, which is for all people, Jews and Gentiles. And in that final afterlife, the righteous of both communities receive reward, and the wicked of both communities receive their I suppose recompense. Oh yeah, you are the best. Um, Here is a little quote about this eschatology, this idea about the end of time, the end of days. Satyagaon says, "Why again should there be any cause to prevent this or distrain therefrom? Nobody should feel hard done by the fact that the Jews get an extra afterlife. Or why should it not be considered as a mere act of justice, whereby whoever has been tried receives compensation in proportion to his trials, since this nation of ours has been subjected by God to great trials? He thinks of the Jews of having been subjected to greater trials than others, because others simply abandoned their religion at some point in time, and we never did. And that cost us a great deal in terms of persecution or whatnot. It is most fitting, therefore, that he should grant to the Jewish people this additional period prior to the world to come." So, in a nutshell, I'm not defending it. I'm not saying this is my view, but you read Satyagaon, and he's basically like, don't think the Jewish people are chosen. God chose all people equally. Don't think God gave a special religion to Moses and didn't give one to he gave a true religion to every nation. It's just none of them stuck to theirs. We're the only remnant from the ancient world that's held on. So that's very nice. We'll get a bit of extra reward for it. But God doesn't love us more than anybody else. And also notice that one of the things that's missing from this picture is any sense of a mission to the Gentiles. In the book of Genesis, you get this notion that we're to bless the peoples of the world. In the book of Exodus, the notion that we're a kingdom of priests makes it look like we have a mission to the non-Jews. None of that's there in Sadja, other than we provide a kind of service. If Gentiles are interested to learn about the seven Noahide laws, we can teach them. But he doesn't seem possessed of a of a of a sense of mission, a sense of calling, and that's what we're here to do. That's our mission as a people. In fact, like I said, there's no chapter in his book on chosenness or the election. This is something you have to piece together. It's so deflationary, I would say. It's deflationary of chosenness. We're going to see two more medieval thinkers. One of them is perhaps a little less, but only a little less deflationary than Sadhya. And then we're going to see another one which is really inflationary and says stuff that you can't be found in the Bible at all. And I'm going to try and give a philosophical diagnosis as to what's happening here in the medieval period. But let's, I am a doctor, so I get to give diagnoses, right? So let's move on to Maimonides. Okay, the only slightly less deflationary view. Now, it should always be said. Menachem Kellner said this. I've heard this joke from him and from Joseph Stern, but everyone says, you have your Maimonides, I have my Maimonides, right? There's my Maimonides, your Maimonides, his Maimonides, her Maimonides. This is my Maimonides, and what I mean by that is Maimonides wrote a huge amount, and a lot of what he wrote is open to multiple interpretations. So this gives rise to the possibility of very many interpretations of Maimonides on any given theme, and chosenness is no different. In the Mishneh Torah, which is a book that he wrote avowedly for the masses, he writes the following. He writes that Abraham was something like a philosopher, of course, because Maimonides was a philosopher. So Abraham was something like a philosopher who discovered monotheism and taught it widely. He wanted everyone to know the truth of monotheism, the truth he had discovered. But within a short time, the fundamental principle that Abraham had planted would have been uprooted, and the descendants of Jacob would have returned to the errors of the world and their crookedness. Because of God's love for us, and to uphold the oath he made for Abraham our patriarch, he brought forth Moses our teacher, the master of all prophets, and sent him to redeem the Jews. After Moses our teacher prophesied and God chose Israel as his inheritance, he crowned them with his commandments and informed them of the path to serve him, teaching them the judgment prescribed for an idol worshipper and all those who stray after it. A couple of things that need to be pointed out here. I'm one of those scholars who thinks that we should always try to reconcile the Maimonides who wrote the Mishneh Torah with the Maimonides who wrote the Guide for the Perplexed. Other scholars think no need to reconcile those two authors. They had different agendas, different audiences, and he's happy contradicting himself between those two books. Maybe because I'm a more naive person, I take things at face value. No, I think that Maimonides believed what he wrote in the Guide to the Perplexed, and he believed what he wrote in the Mishneh Torah, and we need to find some way of reconciling the two whenever there's a tension. With that in mind, okay, I want to say two things. One thing about prophecy and one thing about love. So about prophecy. Maimonides develops in the Guide to the Perplexed what's called a naturalistic theory of prophecy. What this means is that God is constantly broadcasting his wisdom. What it means to be a prophet is to tune into that broadcast. It's not like God all of a sudden, on Monday wants to speak to Martha, so says, Martha, Martha, and then tells Martha what she needs to hear on another day. Talia, I want to talk to you now. No, God is just constantly broadcasting wisdom. And the prophets are the people who manage to tune into that. And one of the reasons it's called naturalistic is because it is the natural state of a perfected human being to be a prophet. If only we perfected ourselves, we would all become prophets. In fact, the miraculous thing is God can stop a prophet from hearing the wisdom if he doesn't want them to hear it. Right? So the miraculous thing is when people who are really perfected don't hear God speak to them. Why not? Well, God doesn't want them to hear, so God blocks their ears, so to speak. But the natural way of things is for those who are perfected, and perfected means in intellect and in character. So there's no such thing, and this is part of what makes Maimonides such an elitist. There's no such thing as an illiterate or dim prophet. Prophets are all very, very wise, highly, highly educated, but they also have to be good people. It's and for Maimonides, these two things come in tandem. You can't truly be a sage without also being righteous. And perhaps the highest levels of righteousness require sagacity, require you to be sage-like. That I'm less clear about in Maimonides. But with that in mind, God didn't one day knock on Abraham's door and say, Lech Lecha. Rather, Abraham built himself up as a great intellect and as a great person, and then as any human being would after such a process, he heard God's voice, he heard God speak. So when it says, because God's love of us and to uphold the oath he made to Abraham, our patriarch, God brought forth Moses, our teacher, that has to be a kind of poetic flourish, because it's not like God arranged for Moses to be a prophet. That's not how prophecy works, according to Maimonides. Rather, Moses would have done that work on himself to become wise enough, to become good enough to hear God's voice. So I would read it as something like, God arranged it that when the next great prophet arose, he received the Torah. Okay, something like that. And what about the love? God's great love for us. Well, Maimonides had a certain view about emotion that he articulates in the Guide to the Perplexed. He thinks that emotions are a product of the body. They're not a product of the intellect. This is a very kind of Greek. It's actually not necessarily in Maimonides, but it's actually tied up with a certain type of misogyny of the ancient world, which is that men are disembodied intellects and women are kind of erotically embodied, but centers of passion and emotion. And passion and emotion is this feminine thing which kind of clouds the intellect being this very male thing. Thankfully, philosophers no longer think like that, and philosophy no longer besmirches neither femininity nor emotionality. In fact, many people today think of the emotions as an essential part of the cognitive life, that they're not like separate from wisdom. There are wise emotions even. But that's not how Maimonides saw things. Maimonides saw emotion as a kind of bodily imperfection. So he says in the Guide to the Perplexed, whenever God is described as having an emotion, you need to reread it. You need to reread the text. What it really means is God acts in the world in such a way that the best explanation of his action, were he a psychological being, would be emotional. That's to say, God. So when we say God is angry, what we mean is God has caused things to happen in the world which we would naturally attribute to anger, were God the sort of being that could feel anger, right? When we say God is happy with us, we say God is making things happen in the world which we would attribute to happiness, were God the sort of being that could feel happiness. Likewise, when it says God loves the Jewish people, it means God acts in the world in such a way that makes it look as if God loves the Jewish people, because his treatment of the Jewish people is different to his treatment of other peoples. And were God the sort of being that could have feelings, the best explanation of his actions would be through emotions. So again, taking the guide for the perplexed and reading the Mishnah Torah through it, I have to say something like this. So we'll go from the word because of God's love for us. It have to be like this. Because of God's pattern of behavior regarding the Jews, which makes it look as if he loves us, and in order to uphold the oath he made to Abraham, our patriarch, he made sure that when the next prophet in the line of Israel rose up, he was given the Torah. Something like that. Okay. Now, another detail we need to understand. So Abraham discovers God. He discovers monotheism. In fact, to be really accurate and faithful to Maimonides, he rediscovers monotheism, because all of humanity believed in what Maimonides calls dat ha'emet, the true religion. All humanity believed in the true religion before around the time of Enosh, when people started to worship idols. Abraham rediscovered the true religion. It seems as if Maimonides believes, well, it seems as if, it's pretty clear to me that Maimonides believes that in the end of days, all people will believe in the true religion. Okay. And he actually believes that Christianity and Islam are tools in the hands of God for spreading some of the kind of conceptual vocabulary that needs to be spread around the world, such that when the Messiah comes, they'll understand what's going on, and the true religion will finally be spread to all four corners of the world. So this is what he writes about Christianity and Islam. He says, can there be a greater stumbling block than Christianity? Right? If you think about all of the oppression that Christianity created in the life of the Jews, all the prophets spoke of the Messiah as the Redeemer of Israel and their Savior, who would gather their dispersed and strengthened their observance of the commandments. In contrast, Christianity caused the Jews to be slain by the sword, their remnants to be scattered and humbled, the Torah to be altered, and the majority of the world to err and serve a God other than the Lord, because they're worshipping Jesus rather than God. Nevertheless, the intent of the Creator of the world is not within the power of man to comprehend, for his ways are not our ways, nor are his thoughts our thoughts. And now, having said that we can't understand why on earth God allowed Christianity to spread, he's about to tell us why he thinks God allowed Christianity to spread. He says, ultimately, all the deeds of Jesus of Nazareth and that Ishmaelite who arose after him, i.e. Muhammad, will only serve to prepare the way for the Messiah's coming and the improvement of the entire world, motivating the nations to serve God together. As Zephaniah states, I will transform the peoples to a purer language so that they will call upon the name of God and serve him with one purpose. How will this come about? The entire world has already become filled with the mention of Messiah, Torah, and commandments, right? Because of the spread of Islam and Christianity, these notions, these Jewish notions, are now part of the conceptual vocabulary of the West, right? Messiah, Torah, commandment. These matters have been spread to the furthermost islands, to many stubborn-hearted nations. So when the true Messianic king will arise and prove successful, his position becoming exalted and uplifted, they will all return and realize that their ancestors endowed them with a false heritage and their prophets and ancestors caused them to err. There's also some evidence that Maimonides thought that all things being equal, there is a mitzvah to try to convert Gentiles to Judaism even now. In his letter, I'll give you two pieces of evidence. They're not smoking guns, but they're evidence. In his letter to Yemen, Igeret Teman, he says that to the Jews of Yemen, he says that even though there is a prohibition on teaching Gentiles Torah, that prohibition doesn't apply to teaching Christians Torah. And the reason it doesn't apply to teaching Christians Torah is they already believe that it's true. So they're not going to mock it. And indeed, he says, there are benefits in teaching Christians Torah because we may lead them to see the truth of our religion. So it looks like he's saying, teach Torah to Christians to convert them, right? But he says, don't do this to Muslims. Now, one of the reasons he may have said, don't do this to Muslims is because it would have got his head chopped off, communicating that in the intellectual milieu and political climate in which he operated. Having said that, he also offers an argument, and the argument is that it's widely believed among Islamic the Islamic faithful that the rabbis perverted the text of the Torah. It's a widespread Muslim belief that the Torah's text has been perverted over time, and therefore you shouldn't teach it to them because they're going to mock it, right? Which isn't the case with the Christians, because the Christians believe in it. So he does give an argument. Anyway, it looks like he's saying, when there's half a chance of convincing them that our religion is true, do it, right? That's what it looks like for me, Geret Teman. Also, there's in the Gemara, it says there are 3 periods of time in which we don't accept converts. 1 is during the kingdom of David, 2 is during the kingdom of Solomon, and 3 is in the Messianic era. And the basic idea behind that is that in those periods, because potentially everyone might want to be Jewish, you can't trust the sincerity of the candidate convert. So the conversion class is just shut, right, during those 3 periods. Now, Maimonides, in general, he codifies Jewish law not just for today, but even for Messianic times. In fact, his legal code is relatively rare among Jewish legal codes. Most of them, like the Shulchan Aruch, only codify Jewish law that is currently practiced. They don't codify Jewish law that's just for the Messianic age. Maimonides codifies the laws that are supposed to govern us even in the Messianic age. Nevertheless, when he comes to codify this particular Gemara, he says, we don't accept converts in the period of King David. We don't accept converts in the period of King Solomon. But he stays stum about the period of the Messianic era. And one potential reason for that is he can't believe that we're going to forbid conversion in the Messianic era, because ultimately our aim is for everybody to be Jewish. And that's when it's going to happen in the Messianic. If not then when, right? So there are reasons for thinking that Maimonides, perhaps as a quite a small minority among rabbinic thinkers, was into proselytism where possible. Certainly, he codifies the obligation on spreading the 7 Noahide laws to the Gentile world, but potentially he goes even further and argues that we should be looking to proselytize. Now, one more piece of the puzzle I want to give you before moving forward in Maimonides is when he codifies the 13 principles of faith, he says this strange and shocking thing. He says anybody who doesn't believe in any one of these 13 leaves the congregation of Israel, right? It's as if, from Maimonides' point of view, you're basically not Jewish if you don't believe in one of these 13 principles. Now, it's not quite as simple as that, because he thinks that by dint of your birth, you have an obligation that Gentiles don't have. The obligation is to see the error of your ways and come back to Judaism. But there's a sense in which if you don't believe in the 13 principles, you're you remain Jewish, but in a kind of attenuated sense. By parity of reasoning, it would seem as if a Gentile believed in all 13, but didn't convert to Judaism, there'd be a sense in which they had joined the congregation of Israel. Just if you look at his words over there, he says, because to be a member of the congregation of Israel is to believe these 13. Now, okay, you don't have formal membership until you've converted. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying anything other than that. But the conclusion that I'm trying to gun for when explaining what Maimonides thinks about chosenness is this. Maimonides thinks that Judaism is chosen, but not the Jews, right? Judaism is a religion that all of humanity used to believe in. It was forgotten, and Abraham happened to be the first person to rediscover it. Now, we were very lucky to be born into the congregation of Abraham. And because God swore an oath to Abraham, we've been kind of held together into this community. But what God really chose is not some ethnicity, right? The people who are merely formally members because they were born into the right community, but a way of life. And it's a way of life that we ultimately hope to spread to all of humanity. So with that picture of chosenness in mind, I want to share with you a quote that says it much better than I could from Menachem Kelman. He says this: the upshot of all this is that Abraham discovered God on his own, so to speak. God did not choose Abraham. God did not seek him out. God did not make himself known to Abraham. God waited till someone discovered, or perhaps more accurately, I've added rediscovered, the truth about him. That someone happened to be Abraham, progenitor of the Jews. It did not have to be Abraham. Had the first human being to discover the truth about God been, say, a Navajo, and had that Navajo philosopher the courage and effectiveness of Abraham, then the Navajos would be the chosen people. The Torah would have been composed in the Navajo language. Its narratives would reflect their history, and many of its commandments would reflect their history and the nature of Navajo society at the time of the giving of the Torah to them. But the inner meaning of the Torah, its philosophical content, its spiritual message, would all be the same, would all be equivalent to the inner meaning, philosophical content, and spiritual message of the Torah as it was indeed revealed to Moses at Sinai. But its outer garment would be dramatically different. So I asked AI to come up with a picture of a Navajo Abraham, and this is what it did. The thought is, and it might still strike people as culturally imperious. The thought is that Judaism is the true religion. There aren't, equally good religions. Judaism is the best, the true, the right. But we shouldn't feel all that special about the fact that we were lucky enough to be born into it. That's just a kind of a genetic lottery that we happen to have won. And ultimately, all human beings are going to come under the umbrella of this religion. It might take a long time. It might, but God doesn't love the Jews more than he loves any other people. Sometimes he may act as if he does, but that's because the wheels of providence are working to try and ultimately, according to Maimonides, make everybody Jewish, right? Which is why it might look sometimes as if we've been favored, but we haven't. And God doesn't love anyway, because God doesn't suffer emotions. But even if he did love, he wouldn't love us any more than he loves anybody else. Now, this is, again, very deflationary. Right? Having read the Bible and then reading Maimonides, you're like, what's happened to chosenness? On the other hand, I would say that the Maimonidean picture is less deflationary than Sadhya, because it at least holds on to a notion of a mission. Really, the Jewish people should be doing everything we can to spread the light of Judaism to Gentiles. Are we living up to that? Well, the seventh Lubavitcher Rebbe argued extensively on the basis of Maimonides that between Maimonides and today, we have singularly failed as a people to take up the mantle of this mission. right? This is a massive mission that the Jewish people are called upon to do, to at least spread the 7 mitzvot, if not to convert all people to Judaism. And you can say, well, how can you say we've been failing for these years? Are you saying that all the great rabbis between Maimonides and the Lubavitcher Rebbe were failures? How could you say such a thing? And the Lubavitcher Rebbe's response was, no, they weren't failures, but history wasn't yet ripe, right? Before the emancipation of the Jews in Europe, we were second-class citizens of the countries in which we lived. We weren't taken seriously. In much of the Muslim world, if we tried to proselytize, we'd have been executed. In the Christian world, for much of the time, the same thing could be said. So we didn't have the opportunity until modernity to take this mantle forward, but it's always been there. It's been there since the time of the Bible, and it was codified by Maimonides. This might make the religious pluralists among us feel a little uncomfortable, right? I don't want to take Christianity away from the Christians, or Islam away from the Muslims, or Hinduism away from the Hindus, right? I don't feel the need to spread Judaism beyond the confines of the Jewish world. Well, if that's your belief, you've got to take that up with the Rambam, okay? And you don't have to be a Maimonidean. I'm not for the record, I'm not a Maimonidean, but I thought, you know, it's an interesting example of where the philosophy of chosenness can go. So we've looked at Satyagaon, we looked at Maimonides. Now we're going to look at the most inflationary account of the medieval period, which is owed to which is owed to the Rihal. But I'm having some difficulty seeing my. Oh, there we go. Okay, good. Can you all see the screen still? The you see my Navajo? Okay, good. Okay. Oh, I wanted to share one more nice piece about Maimonides, just to show that the one element that I think he's not deflationary about, like I said, is that calling, that mission. And that is an element of the priestly model, that we are the priests to the world. We have an obligation to go out to the world and share our religion with them. But one of the things about the priesthood is that the priesthood has its formal membership, and then you could say kind of the friends of membership, right? What do I mean by that? The Rambam writes, not only the tribe of Levi, but each and every person of all the inhabitants of the world whose spirit generously motivates him and who understands with his wisdom to separate himself and stand before God to serve him and minister to him and to know God, proceeding justly as God made him, removing from his neck the yoke of the many reckonings which people seek, he is sanctified as holy of holies. In other words, the Leviim, the Levites in biblical Israel, were supported by public funds, and their job was to study Judaism, preach Judaism, and look after the temple. But Maimonides says, but if somebody else wants to leave the worldly, the kind of the material world behind and dedicate their life to scholarship and study and teaching and preaching, then they're welcome to do so too. They might have to fund themselves, right? They don't have the publicly funded element, but they're welcome to do so too. On the contrary, not only they're welcome to, they're sanctified as holy of holies. And here I'm drawing very much from the Lubavitcher Rebbe, but when the Lubavitcher Rebbe quoted this, he pointed out that Maimonides is very clear here. He's not just talking about the tribe of Levi being supplemented by every other Jew who wants to, but every person of all the inhabitants of the world, right? Any Gentile who dedicates their life to God and to the service of God and to teaching about God is holy of holies, no more, no less than a high priest. You know, so you know, I was thinking of great people who not only did great things, but did those great things in the name of the God of Abraham, right? Like Martin Luther King's civil rights struggles, or Sojourner Truth, or Corrie ten Boom in the Holocaust, who did things in the name, did great things in the name of God. They are, according to Maimonides, holy of holies. They're as chosen as anybody else. So I liked that element of the Maimonidean picture and wanted to share with you before we go to the inflationary picture of Yehuda Halevi. So I'm going to read the next few paragraphs. This is from the Kuzari, the magnum opus of Judah Halevi. And I'm not going to give any kind of, I'm not going to give too much background, because the background, it will be interesting for me to feather that in later. Okay, so let me say this: a Jewish sage is talking to a newly converted Jewish king at this stage of a dialogue that Judah Halevi wrote, a fictional dialogue. Okay, and the Jewish sage is pontificating upon the special nature of the Jewish people. And this is what he says: Adam, as in the first person, was perfection itself, because no flaw could be found in a work of a wise and almighty creator, wrought from a substance chosen by him and fashioned according to his own design. There were no restraining influence, no fear of atavism, which is the tendency to fall back upon bad habits of the past, no question of nutrition or education during the years of childhood and growth. He was made fully formed. He didn't have to go through adolescence and all the regretful kind of chapters of a human education. His intellect was the loftiest which it is possible for a human being to possess, and beyond this, he was gifted with the divine power. Yehuda Halevi believes there's this thing called the divine power or the divine influence that sits upon some people. Okay, and Adam had it to the highest degree. He had it to such a high degree that he was gifted with, that it brought him into connection with beings divine and spiritual. We call Adam God's son, and we call all those who are like him also sons of God. He left many children, of whom the only one capable of taking his place was Abel, Hevel, because he alone was like him. So it's as if Adam was created with this thing called the divine influence or the divine power, but none of his children received it other than Hevel. And then after he'd been slayed by Cain through jealousy of this privilege, that's why Cain slayed him, because he was jealous that he had this thing called the divine influence, and he didn't. It passed on to his brother Seth, who also was like Adam, being, as it were, his essence and heart, while the others, all the rest of humanity, were like husks and rotten fruit, right? So Adam has this amazing gift that he can pass on to at most one of his children, and all of the other children relative to the child that receives this gift are like husks and rotten fruit. The essence of Seth was passed on to Enosh, and in this way the divine influence was inherited by isolated individuals down to Noah. This is almost the opposite of the naturalistic view of prophecy, where any human being, if they rise in intellect and character, will hear God speak. No, you only get to hear God speak if you've inherited something called the divine influence from an ancestor. Okay, it almost sounds genetic. These people, those who've inherited it, they're compared to the heart. They resembled Adam and were styled sons of God. They were perfect outwardly and inwardly, their lives, knowledge, and ability being likewise faultless. Their lives, the lives of this chain of single individuals, each one being the only person in their generation to have the divine influence, their lives fix the chronology from Adam all the way down to Noah, and from Noah all the way down to Abraham. Then, he says, the essence of Abraham passed on to Yitzchak to the exclusion of the other sons, Yishmael and the children he had with Keturah. The prerogative of Yitzchak descended on to Jacob, whilst Esau was sent from the land which belonged to Jacob. The sons of the latter were all worthy of the divine influence. This is the first instance of the divine influence descending on a number of people, whereas it had previously only been vouchsafed to isolated individuals. What's he saying there? What he's saying is, Jacob is the first human being in all of history who not only has the divine influence, but he passes it on to all of his children. They all receive it. And then it almost sounds like epigenetics, right? Not only had genetics not been discovered in the time of Judah Levi, epigenetics certainly hadn't been discovered by the time of Yehuda Levi. But what we know from epigenetics is that it's one thing to inherit a gene. It's another thing for that gene to be switched on. You can have genes which are switched on and genes that are switched off. In the next paragraph, he makes it sound like from that point onwards, every Jew inherits the divine influence, even if they are evil incarnate. All that means is the gene is switched off in them, but their children will still inherit it, right? To show you that that's what he says, let's just read through the next paragraph. Then God tended them in Egypt, multiplied and aggrandized them as a tree with a sound root grows until it produces perfect fruit, resembling the first fruit from which it was planted, viz. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and his brethren. The seed further produced Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, Bezalel, Aholiab, and the chiefs of the tribes, the 70 elders who were all endowed with the spirit of prophecy, then Joshua, Caleb, Hur, and many others. Then they became worthy of having the divine light and providence made visible to them. If disobedient men existed among them, they were hated, but remained without doubt of the essence, inasmuch as they were part of it on account of their descent and nature, and begat children who were of the same stamp. We perceive a similar phenomenon in nature at large. Many people do not resemble their father, but take after their grandfathers. So it can be like a recessive gene. It can skip a generation, but it never disappears. There cannot consequently be any doubt that this nature and resemblance was hidden in the father, although it didn't become visible outwardly, as was the nature of Ever, an ancestor of Terach, in his children. It was hidden until it reappeared in Abraham. So this is the emergence, I'm afraid to say it, there's no other way, no better way of saying it, of Jewish supremacy or Jewish supremacism in intellectual Jewish history. There are worse cases of it that come later, which I'm not going to get into today. What I mean by that, because somebody pointed out in the previous class, well, you might think, I think it was Jennifer who pointed out, you might say that the Bible isn't supremacist, so long as it doesn't say that Abraham was inherently better than others, but it's still, there's still a kind of Jewish superiority, because if not supremacy, because the Jews are given this important job that Gentiles aren't given. So what I mean by supremacy is this supremacism is the view that we're inherently, innately better. And I don't see that, in any explicit place in the Bible. I don't even see it explicitly in the works of the rabbis, although, please God, this project will come out as a book and you can read what I have to say about some of the rabbinic literature. But my God, this is supremacism. This is saying Jews are just of a different kind to Gentiles. Jews are the ones that have the divine influence. Gentiles are the ones that don't. Let me say a couple of things in his defense, but they're not going to remove the charge of supremacism from him. But the first thing is that the Rihal thinks that the Jews are better than the Gentiles in one respect and one respect only, which is their proclivity to prophecy. He doesn't think that we're inherently better behaved than Gentiles. He doesn't think that we have more rights than Gentiles. He may think that there are Gentiles who are much better than Jews at many other important things, maybe better at philosophy, maybe better at science, maybe better, and these are things that he values greatly, maybe better at all sorts of things. But the supremacy is located in one faculty only, the faculty to prophecy. Second thing is, he's very clear, much clearer than Maimonides. He believes that by the time Messiah comes, everybody will be Jewish. So this difference between Jews and Gentiles is temporary. It's not going to last. Eventually, all people will be grafted in. Now, he does say that even if you convert to Judaism, right, you don't get this divine influence just by converting. He doesn't think it's possible to be a convert and a prophet, for example. But he does think that the children of converts inherit the divine influence. And it seems, and here I'm following the influential reading of David Novak, a scholar in Toronto, it seems he even thinks that if two converts have a child, that child will be born with a divine influence. The idea is you need to be born into the body of Israel. And if you're born into the body of Israel, you'll have it. Why does he think this? What's going on? And let me just see what the next slide is. 1 second, share. Okay, yeah, good. Why does he think this? And why is he so revisionary? The Bible doesn't say that only Jews can be prophets. In fact, the Bible has Bilam, a non-Jewish prophet, right? Long after Isaac. As I tried to argue, and as I said in response to Jennifer, I accept that you could get a sense of Jewish superiority from a reading of the Hebrew Bible, because the Jews have been given this superior role to play in history. But supremacism, the idea, I mean, isn't that the whole idea of Genesis, that all humans were created in the image and likeness of God, right? We all descendants of the same two people. That's the thrust, the moral thrust of the message of the book of Genesis. And there's also a kind of dramatic irony. The Kuzari is a book about a non-Jewish king who has these dreams in which God speaks to him and says that his heart is in the right place, but his actions are not in the right place. So he's like, he keeps having this recurring dream. So he looks into Christianity, he looks into Islam, he looks into Greek philosophy, and finally he's convinced to look into Judaism. And then finally, he converts to Judaism. By the way, he only converts to Judaism not after his arguments with the sage, but after experiencing a mystical Shabbat in a cave on the seaside. So this is a book about the mystical religious experiences of a non-Jew that lead him to convert to the true religion. And it's in this book that we learn that it's the Jews who have a special sensitivity to mystical experience, religious experience, and prophecy, and that Gentiles don't. There's a kind of an irony that Yehuda Halevi would choose to teach that lesson in this way. With the most religiously sensitive person in the book is not the sage, it's the king, right? That's how it's written. So it's almost as if Yehuda Halevi kind of contradicts himself, or kind of undermines his own case. At the very least, I'd want to say this. Racism didn't come naturally to Yehuda Halevi, right? So why the racist conclusions? Now, okay, we're not going to get to the modern period. We've only got one more one more minute left. So let me end with my conclusion of the medieval period at the very least, and I'll take some questions. And I'll set you up for the sorts of things we might see in modernity. Medieval Jewish philosophers, even Yehuda Halevi, who had a certain amount of disdain for philosophy, but all medieval Jewish philosophers, including Yehuda Halevi, would have said that God is not a person. What do I mean by saying God is not a person? Well, a person is a being that has, this is my definition of personhood. It's inspired by Heschel, but it's also inspired by the Western philosophical tradition. A person is a being with logos, pathos, and ethos, who is consciously aware of having logos, pathos, and ethos. What are those three things? Well, roughly, logos is having beliefs about how the world is. Ethos is having beliefs about how the world should be. And pathos is there being a feeling, right? Maimonides looks down on emotion. Pathos is the possession of emotion. There being something that it feels like. I imagine there's something that it feels like to be a bat. I just don't know what it feels like. I don't know, but I imagine there is something that it feels like to be a bat. But I don't imagine there's something that it feels like to be a spoon, right? So I would say the spoon doesn't have pathos, the bat has pathos. A person is a being who is consciously aware of having logos, ethos, and pathos. Also, I would say a person is a being capable of interpersonal relationship, okay? Sajagan, Maimonides, and Yehuda Halevi would say God is not a person. Not because God doesn't have a body. You don't need to have a body to be a person on my definition of personhood, right? Because God is so supreme, so sublime, so other, that no human word can do him justice. No human word can contain him. Even saying that God is wise is to speak with the vulgar, because God is above wisdom, right? So all three philosophers are thinking of God as this unmoved, unmovable, something we dare not say what, that lives beyond the power of language to describe. And because of that, they simply can't imagine a God sitting around in heaven waiting for a person he quite likes to come around and saying, oh, hey, Abe, I quite like you. Shall we make a covenant? You can be my chosen people. Okay. There's no room in their theology for God to act in that way. So Sadja says God chooses all people, right? And he reveals his religion to every nation at the beginning of their nationhood. To Maimonides, God says God's always broadcasting. He's broadcasting to everybody. It's just Abraham was the only one who heard him. Had some Navajo person heard him, then the Navajos would have been the chosen people. And eventually all people will hear him and all people will be Jewish. But God didn't choose Abraham. That's not the sort of thing God does. God isn't a person. The Rihal is moved by much the same logic. Rihal being Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. He's saying, on the one hand, God can't choose a people because God isn't a person like that. On the other hand, the Bible sure makes it seem as if God has chosen the Jews, and Sajagan is too deflationary, and Maimonides is too deflationary. I know what I'll do. I'll make the Jewish people a completely different species to the rest of humanity, and then God doesn't need to make a choice. There's no choosing, right? Because a choice is when you've got like two options you could go with. There was only one option. And since there's only one option, there's no choice. So to put it as bluntly as you could possibly put it, the medieval Jewish philosophers were so taken by Greek theology that they couldn't imagine God choosing. So Sadja and Maimonides go one way and basically say either God didn't choose or he chose everyone. And the Rihal goes another way and says God didn't choose because there was no choice to make, because the Jews are just different to everybody. Thankfully, in the modern age, the grip of Greek theology starts to loosen its hold over rabbinic thinking. And you start to get Jewish thinkers who say, well, okay, I know God is wholly other. I know God isn't like some big human being in the sky. I know that. But to the extent that we can describe him at all, he is a personal being. He's a being who interacts with other persons, a person who feels, who has appropriate emotional responses to emotional stimuli, who thinks and feels and reacts and interacts. Sure, the best picture we could ever have of God is at best an approximation. But even so, in the approximation we have of God, we think of God in personal terms. And that's going to allow modern Jewish thinkers to adopt much more biblical accounts of chosenness, where, yeah, God really does choose the Jewish people. And to come back to the point well, a point that I wanted to make in response to Jennifer's claim about superiority, there's a very, very beautiful thinker called Israel Lipschitz in the early 19th century Germany, who basically argues in his commentary to the Mishnah, and here I'll end. He says, God chose the Jews to be a light unto the nations. Sometimes we succeed and sometimes we fail. This was a tremendous privilege. And on the one hand, it means we have a kind of superiority over the Gentiles because we get a head start in life, right? We are born closer to God and with knowledge, inherited institutional knowledge of what it is God wants from us. So we've got this massive benefit. On the other hand, says the Tiferet Yisrael, the reason God didn't choose everybody is because God actually likes and cherishes cultural diversity. He wants each culture and people to make themselves. And the thing is, Jews, they don't get the chance to make themselves. Any achievement that you achieve in this life, you achieve in great part, to a great extent, because you had a head start, because you were given the Torah, because you had Jewish, you had this Jewish heritage that we believe has been God inspired. So you go around walking about proud of all your achievements, but then they're not all that much to write home about because you had a head start. The Gentiles, they don't get to be born with this head start, and they don't get to be among the elect, the chosen. But when they succeed, the Tiferet Yisrael says, God values their achievements more highly than he values the achievements of the Jewish people. So he tries to kind of level the playing field in response to the sorts of concerns that Jennifer raises. But the main point that I wanted to raise is that the medieval Jewish philosophy just doesn't have a place for chosenness. They either have to go super deflationary or super inflationary because of their theology, because they don't believe in a God who can choose. But the Bible seems to believe in a God who can choose. And modernity, if we had a class 4, we would look at modern Jewish thinkers. They're much less reticent to speak in terms of God choosing the Jews, but not, God forbid, because we have some innate property lacking in the Gentiles, but because God values cultural and human diversity. But he wanted there to be one culture in the mix that would function as some sort of light unto the others. Anyway, that's the best I can do in the time I had allotted. I can stay over a few minutes if people have some questions, but thank you for sharing these sessions with me, and I wish you a Chag Sameach for Shavuot.
Thank you.
If anyone has any questions or comments, now is a good time to unmute and say them out loudly.
I mean, one wonders what all those individuals would have thought if they could appear now.
Yeah, that's right. So, for instance, Maimonides thought of emotions as a bodily imperfection over the intellect. But there's so much cognitive psychology now, and so many advances in the science of psychology that give emotions much more of a kind of central role in the life of the mind, right? It's very hard for me to think that Maimonides would say many of the things that he said were he around today. You know, he was a product of his time, as we all are.
But on the other hand, he was such a logical thinker. Now he would have maybe been enthralled by the science that's demonstrating the connection between body and mind or
no
emotion,
doubt.
right?
No doubt he
It
would
might
have
have
been
won him
enthralled.
over just because he would
Yeah, I
respect.
like to think that. And like one thing you can see in Maimonides is there's a basic egalitarianism. He doesn't go the way that that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi goes. All human beings are inherently equal. They're created equal. He had no time for the idea of kind of superior races. But no, I agree with him. I think because one thing we know for sure is that he was interested in the sciences. So I imagine if he was alive today, he'd be interested in the sciences of today, and that would influence his theology.
But by the same token, it doesn't look to me, not that I know much about it, that the Lubavitchers have really changed their message, right? There's straight.
No, that's right. And you know, that they much prefer the Rambam of the Mishnah Torah to the Rambam of the Moreh Nevuchim anyway. Yeah. They don't spend too much time listening to the guide. And then it's quite peculiar, because then you get these streams of Judaism who are wedded to Maimonides, who in turn is wedded to Aristotelian physics. And you're like, well, why are you learning Aristotelian physics? It's not true, right? Yeah. And Maimonides wouldn't be learning Aristotelian physics if he were alive today, you know. So yeah, it is an irony. Yeah. Oh. Anyway.
Really wonderful series. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Martha. Thank you, everybody.
Any other questions? Okay, it doesn't look like it. Thank you so much, Rabbi Lebens, for this full series. And thank you also to everyone who participated and is always part of our learning community here in Drisha. Just a reminder that Mishnah in Depth Avot has started. The class recording is up on the Drisha's YouTube channel as well. All of the classes are recorded and the recordings are on the Drisha YouTube channel. Starting this week, we also have Torah for All, Jewish Universalism in Early Rabbinic Thought with Miss Sami, Thursday night at 8 p.m. Eastern. You can sign up for any offerings at drisha.org/classes. Thank you again, Rabbi Lebens.
Thank you.
And Lehitraot. Chag Sameach.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.